A seasoned veteran stood frozen in his tracks as a massive grizzly bear emerged from the Montana wilderness, dragged itself onto his remote cabin's porch, and did something that defied everything he knew about these apex predators. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It laid down, submissively, crying out in a way that seemed almost human. When he discovered why this 900-pound beast had traveled 15 miles through treacherous terrain to seek his help, even this battle-hardened former Special Forces operator found himself fighting back tears. Former Master Sergeant James "Jim" Reynolds had seen his share of extraordinary situations during his 20 years with the Special Forces, but nothing in his combat experience could have prepared him for what awaited him on that bitter, cold Montana morning. His decision to settle in the remote wilderness after retirement had been deliberate. The solitude of his grandfather's restored cabin, nestled deep in the Gallatin National Forest, offered him the peace he needed after years of active duty. The morning had started like any other in early December, with Jim following his usual routine of checking his weather equipment and surveillance cameras. Living 40 miles from the nearest town meant self-reliance wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. The former soldier had transformed the century-old family cabin into a modern sanctuary, equipped with solar panels, satellite communications, and a sophisticated security system that helped him monitor the surrounding wildlife. His military training had never quite left him, and he maintained a disciplined approach to wilderness living. Each morning, he would review the previous night's footage from his trail cameras, keeping track of the local wildlife movements, particularly the bears that hadn't yet settled into hibernation. This winter had been unusually mild, causing some of the local wildlife to delay their winter sleep. But this morning was different. The first hint that something was amiss came when he noticed the unusual pattern of animal movements on his cameras. The local deer, usually abundant in the meadow near his cabin, had vanished. The ravens, typically vocal at dawn, were conspicuously silent. Years of tracking and hunting had taught Jim that when the forest fell quiet, something significant was happening. As he sat at his communication desk, sipping his morning coffee and scanning the camera feeds, movement on the northern perimeter caught his attention. At first, he assumed it was one of the regular bears passing through. He'd documented several in the area over the past months, but this bear's behavior immediately struck him as unusual. The massive grizzly was moving with determination, but something was off about its gait. It seemed to be struggling, yet pressing forward with singular purpose. Jim watched, transfixed, as the bear ignored easily accessible food sources, including his neighbor's cattle 5 miles north, and moved deliberately toward his cabin. 20 years in Special Forces had taught Jim to trust his instincts, and everything about this situation felt unprecedented. He quickly checked his rifles, more out of habit than intention, and moved to his observation post, a reinforced window position that gave him a clear view of the approaching animal. The bear's size was impressive even by Montana standards. Jim estimated it at around 900 pounds, with the distinctive shoulder hump and dish-shaped face characteristic of grizzlies. But it was the bear's eyes that caught his attention. They held an intelligence and desperation that seemed almost human. As he observed through his binoculars, the bear's condition became clearer. Its fur was matted with ice and blood, suggesting it had traveled far and encountered trouble along the way. The animal's movements, though labored, showed no signs of aggression. Instead, it exhibited behavior that Jim had never seen in 2 decades of wilderness experience. The grizzly approached, his cabin's porch with deliberate slowness, its head low, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like whimpers. Jim's military training screamed at him to neutralize the potential threat, But his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through countless missions, told him something else was happening here. The bear's next action defied everything. Jim knew about wild animals. Upon reaching his porch, the massive creature slowly lowered itself to the ground, laying its head on its paws in a posture of complete submission. The behavior was so unexpected, so contrary to everything known about grizzly bears, that Jim found himself questioning his own eyes. But it was what happened next that truly shook him. The bear began making a sound he had never heard before. A deep, rhythmic crying that seemed to carry both desperation and hope. As Jim watched, the animal would occasionally lift its head, look directly at him through the window, then turn its gaze toward the distant forest, before returning to its submissive posture. In all his years of military service and wilderness experience, Jim had learned that the most challenging moments often required decisions that couldn't be found in any manual. As he stood watching this apex predator displaying such unprecedented behavior, he knew he was facing one of those moments. What he didn't know was that his decision in the next few minutes would lead to one of the most extraordinary wildlife encounters ever documented in Montana's history. Jim scrutinized the bear through his high-powered scope, noting details that his 20 years of Special Forces experience told him were highly unusual. The massive grizzly wasn't just acting strangely, it was displaying behavior that defied everything known about these apex predators. Its movements were deliberate, almost calculated, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. Living in the remote Montana wilderness had taught Jim to respect the unpredictable nature of wild animals, particularly grizzlies. After retiring from Special Forces, he'd chosen this isolated location precisely because it offered both solitude and the challenge of coexisting with nature's most formidable creatures. But nothing in his extensive wilderness experience had prepared him for what he was witnessing. The bear's physical condition told its own story. Its fur was matted with ice and blood, suggesting it had traveled far through difficult terrain. Despite its massive size, Jim estimated around 900 pounds, it showed signs of exhaustion that went beyond normal winter lethargy. This bear had been pushing itself hard, driving through extreme conditions with single-minded purpose. Years of military observation training kicked in as Jim documented the bear's behavior patterns. Every 20 minutes, like clockwork, it would rise from its submissive position, take several steps toward the forest, then return to its spot on his porch. The movements weren't random. They held purpose, as if the bear was trying to communicate something specific. Jim's cabin security system continued recording the bear's unusual actions. The sophisticated cameras he'd installed, originally meant to monitor potential threats to his remote homestead, now captured behavior that would challenge wildlife experts' understanding of these powerful predators. The bear wasn't just acting unusually, it was demonstrating a level of intelligent behavior that should have been impossible. Through his scope, Jim noticed more telling details. The bear was a female, likely nursing given her physical characteristics. This detail added another layer of complexity to the already puzzling situation. Mother bears were known to be exceptionally aggressive when their cubs were involved, yet this one was deliberately making herself vulnerable by approaching a human dwelling. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across his porch as the bear maintained her position. The temperature had dropped significantly, and another storm system was approaching from the northwest. Weather conditions would soon become dangerous, yet the bear showed no signs of seeking proper shelter. Whatever had driven her to seek human help must have been desperately important. Jim's satellite phone lay silent, his calls to local wildlife authorities going unanswered. The recent storm had damaged several communication towers in the region, effectively cutting him off from official support. This situation, whatever it was would require him to draw on his years of military experience and wilderness knowledge to handle alone. As he continued his observation, Jim noticed more subtle aspects of the bear's behavior that his military training flagged as significant. Despite her exhaustion, she maintained awareness of her surroundings, regularly scanning the tree line and testing the wind, behaviors more reminiscent of tactical surveillance than typical wildlife patterns. The bear's breathing pattern caught his attention next. Though labored from exhaustion, it remained controlled, almost measured. During his Special Forces years, Jim had learned to read breathing patterns as indicators of intention and emotional state. This bear's breathing suggested purpose rather than panic, determination rather than desperation. The approaching storm brought another dimension to the situation. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind had begun to pick up strength. The bear's reaction to these changing weather conditions showed clear awareness of the approaching danger, yet she remained at her post, committed to whatever had driven her to seek human help. Jim's years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, particularly in unprecedented situations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Those same instincts were now telling him that this bear wasn't just acting strangely, she was acting with intelligence and purpose. The question wasn't whether she needed help, but what kind of help she was seeking. Using his surveillance equipment, Jim began mapping the bear's likely path to his cabin. The tracks in the snow told a story of determination. She had traveled in a nearly straight line through difficult terrain, ignoring easier paths and potential food sources. This wasn't random wandering. She had chosen his cabin specifically. The discovery raised more questions. His wasn't the only human dwelling in the region. There were ranger stations and other cabins closer to where her tracks originated. Why had she passed those by to reach him? Was it simply chance, or was there something about his location that had drawn her? As the morning wore on, Jim continued his careful observation, knowing that his next decision could mean the difference between life and death, not just for the bear, but potentially for himself as well. His military experience had taught him that the most challenging situations often required decisions that couldn't be found in any manual or protocol. The next several hours became a careful dance of observation and analysis. Jim's Special Forces training kicked in as he methodically documented the bear's behavior, noting every subtle movement and vocalization. Through his high-powered scope, he could see the animal was a female, likely nursing given her physical characteristics. The discovery added another layer of complexity to the already puzzling situation. Living in the wilderness had taught Jim to be cautious, but also to recognize when something extraordinary was occurring. He'd dealt with problem bears before, had even needed to relocate a few that got too comfortable around human settlements. But this was different. The grizzly's behavior defied everything wildlife experts had documented about these powerful predators. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across his porch as the bear maintained her submissive position. Every 20 minutes or so, she would rise, take a few steps toward the forest, then return to her spot, making those same haunting sounds that seemed to carry both pleading and purpose. It was as if she was trying to communicate something specific. Jim's satellite phone lay silent, despite his calls to the local wildlife authorities. The recent snowstorm had damaged several communication towers in the region, leaving him effectively cut off from official support. Whatever was happening here, he would have to handle it alone, something his years in Special Forces had prepared him well for. As he continued his observation, Jim noticed more details that pointed to the urgency of the bear's situation. Her fur wasn't just matted with ice and blood. There were fresh scratches and tears that suggested a recent struggle. The blood wasn't from a kill. It was her own. More telling was the pattern of her movements. She wasn't acting like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Her behavior suggested purpose rather than desperation for herself. Through his years of wilderness living, Jim had developed a deep respect for the intelligence of grizzlies. He'd seen them solve complex problems to access food, use tools in basic ways, and demonstrate remarkable memory for locations and paths. But this level of apparent communication with humans was unprecedented. The bear seemed to understand that she needed help and had specifically sought it out. The former Master Sergeant found himself drawing parallels to his military experience. He'd seen similar behavior in combat zones, local civilians approaching military units despite the obvious dangers, desperate for help with an emergency. The bear's actions followed a surprisingly similar pattern: careful approach, clear submission, and persistent attempts to communicate urgency. As noon approached, the temperature began to drop again, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Another storm was moving in, common for December in Montana. The bear's behavior became more urgent, her soft cries taking on a new intensity. She would look at the approaching storm clouds, then back at Jim, her movements becoming more agitated, though still non-threatening. Jim's decades of military experience had taught him to trust his instincts, especially in unprecedented situations. Those same instincts were now telling him that this bear wasn't just acting strangely. She was acting with intelligence and purpose. The question wasn't whether she needed help, but what kind of help she was seeking. Using his surveillance equipment, Jim began mapping the bear's likely path to his cabin. The tracks in the snow told a story of determination. She had traveled in a nearly straight line through difficult terrain, ignoring easier paths and potential food sources. This wasn't random wandering. She had chosen his cabin specifically. The discovery raised more questions. His cabin, while remote, wasn't the only human dwelling in the region. There were ranger stations and other cabins closer to where her tracks originated. Why had she passed those by to reach him? Was it simply chance, or was there something about his location that had drawn her? As the afternoon wore on, Jim began preparing for what he increasingly felt would be necessary: following this bear into the wilderness. His military experience had taught him the importance of proper preparation, especially when heading into uncertain situations. He began gathering his cold weather gear, medical supplies, and emergency equipment, all while maintaining careful observation of his unusual visitor. The bear's reaction to his movement inside the cabin was telling. Each time he passed by windows, with gear in hand, she became more animated, as if recognizing that help was coming. Her cries took on a different tone. Less desperate, more anticipatory. It was behavior that would have seemed anthropomorphic if Jim hadn't been witnessing it with his own eyes. The approaching storm added urgency to the situation. If he was going to help this animal, it needed to be soon. The weather forecast he'd checked that morning had predicted heavy snow and dangerous temperature drops by nightfall. Whatever had driven this bear to seek human help, time was clearly running out. Making his final preparations, Jim faced a decision that went against everything wildlife experts recommended. His satellite phone's last connection had brought a clear warning from the regional ranger station: do not, under any circumstances, follow a wild bear into the wilderness. But 20 years of Special Forces operations had taught him that sometimes the most important decisions weren't found in any manual. The massive grizzly watched intently as Jim emerged from his cabin, fully equipped for wilderness tracking. His gear was a mixture of military and civilian equipment, a testament to his unique background. He carried his trusty .338 Winchester Magnum rifle, not with the intention to use it, but as a last resort for protection. His backpack contained emergency medical supplies, survival gear, and enough provisions for several days if needed. The bear's reaction to his appearance was immediate and striking. She rose from her submissive position, making soft huffing sounds that seemed almost relieved. Jim had encountered many bears during his years in Montana, but he'd never seen one exhibit such clear communication attempts. She moved a few steps toward the tree line, then looked back at him expectantly, repeating the behavior he'd observed earlier, but with new energy. Before following, Jim activated his cabin's security protocols, a system he'd developed during his first year of retirement. Multiple cameras would record his departure and monitor the property in his absence. He'd also left detailed notes about the situation and his intended actions, a habit formed during his military years that had saved lives more than once. The bear's tracks told a compelling story. Despite her size and apparent urgency, she had chosen a path that seemed deliberately easy for a human to follow. Instead of pushing through dense underbrush, as bears typically would, she stayed on game trails and natural clearings. It was as if she understood the limitations of human movement through wilderness terrain. As they moved deeper into the forest, Jim noticed more unusual aspects of the bear's behavior. She maintained a steady pace, constantly checking back to ensure he was following, but never showing any aggression or impatience. When he needed to check his bearings or consult his GPS, she would wait, watching him with those unusually intelligent eyes. The temperature continued to drop as they moved higher into the mountains. The storm system was moving in faster than predicted, bringing with it a threatening wall of dark clouds. Jim's weather meter showed an alarming drop in barometric pressure, a sure sign of severe weather approaching. Whatever this bear needed help with, they were racing against time. After about 2 miles of tracking, Jim began to notice signs that something was wrong in this part of the forest. The natural sounds of wildlife had disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that his military training recognized as a warning sign. Even the wind seemed to carry a different quality here, and there was an unusual smell that his years of wilderness experience couldn't quite identify. The bear's behavior changed too. Her movements became more cautious, and her vocalizations took on a different tone, softer, almost worried. She led him through a series of switchbacks that seemed to avoid certain areas of the forest, despite them appearing to offer easier passage. Jim's instincts told him she was deliberately steering clear of something. As they approached what appeared to be a small clearing, the bear's pace slowed significantly. She turned to look at Jim with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, if such a thing were possible in a wild animal. The wind shifted, and suddenly the strange smell became clear. It was chemical, artificial, something that had no place in this wilderness. The clearing ahead showed signs of human activity, but not the usual kind found in these mountains. There were no hunting blinds or camping equipment. Instead, Jim's trained eye spotted something far more concerning, traces of what appeared to be illegal activity. Scattered equipment and disturbed earth suggested someone had been using this remote location for purposes they wanted to keep hidden. The bear moved forward cautiously, leading Jim toward what looked like a recent excavation. As they got closer, his military training kicked in, and he began to notice more details that set off alarm bells. The ground had been professionally disturbed. This wasn't the work of amateur prospectors or weekend treasure hunters. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever they were doing here. Jim's hand instinctively moved to his rifle as they approached the site. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize signs of danger, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The bear, however, seemed focused on something specific. She moved with purpose toward what appeared to be a partially concealed opening in the ground, making those same desperate sounds he'd heard at his cabin. The storm was getting closer, with the first few snowflakes beginning to fall. The wind had picked up significantly, carrying with it the promise of the severe weather system that had been predicted. As Jim stood at the edge of this mysterious clearing, watching a desperate mother bear trying to show him something, he realized that the next few minutes would likely reveal why this magnificent predator had risked everything to seek human help. The sight that greeted Jim at the concealed opening made his combat-hardened heart skip a beat. There, trapped in what appeared to be an illegally constructed underground storage facility, were two bear cubs, but they weren't alone. The makeshift chamber, roughly 15 feet deep, also contained crates marked with warnings that made Jim's military experience immediately relevant. This wasn't just a random excavation, it was a hidden cache of illegal materials. The cubs were trapped on a narrow ledge about halfway down, desperately trying to maintain their balance on the crumbling surface. Their cries, weak but audible, explained their mother's frantic search for help. But the situation was far more complicated than a simple rescue. The warning labels on the crates below the cubs told Jim this was now a matter of national security. His Special Forces training kicked in as he quickly assessed the scene. The storage facility had been professionally constructed, with reinforced walls and a sophisticated ventilation system. This was the work of organized criminals, not amateur operators. The cubs had apparently fallen through a camouflaged entrance, becoming unwitting witnesses to something that powerful people would want to keep hidden. The mother bear's behavior now made perfect sense. She hadn't just been seeking help for her cubs, she'd inadvertently led a former Special Forces operator to a significant criminal operation. Her maternal instinct had accomplished what months of law enforcement surveillance might have failed to discover. Jim's mind raced with the implications. This explained the bear's specific choice to seek him out. His cabin, while not the closest human habitation, was the only one in the area with military-grade security cameras and satellite equipment. Whether by incredible instinct or pure chance, she had chosen the one person in the region with both the skills to help her cubs and the experience to understand the broader significance of this discovery. The cubs' situation was deteriorating rapidly. The ledge they clung to was showing signs of imminent collapse, and the approaching storm would soon make any rescue attempt exponentially more dangerous. But the presence of the illegal cache complicated matters significantly. Any disturbance to the structure could trigger collapse or, worse, damage the suspicious containers below. Drawing on his military experience, Jim began formulating a plan. The cubs' safety was priority one, but he couldn't ignore the broader implications of what he'd discovered. He needed to document everything without disturbing the scene, evidence that would later prove crucial for authorities. Using his phones, a camera, he carefully photographed the warning labels visible on the crates, making sure to capture identifying marks and serial numbers. The mother bear watched his documentation with what seemed like impatience, making soft sounds that reminded him of the urgent matter at hand. The cubs, hearing their mother's calls, attempted to climb higher, causing small avalanches of dirt and debris to rain down on the crates below. Time was running out on multiple fronts. Jim's rescue equipment, though professional grade, wasn't designed for this kind of operation. He had ropes and climbing gear, but the unstable nature of the structure meant any conventional rescue attempt could bring the whole thing down. The cubs were too young and weak to grasp any rope he might lower, and the space was too narrow for him to climb down without risking further collapse. The wind had picked up significantly, carrying the first heavy snowflakes of the approaching storm. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Jim could see the cubs shivering on their precarious perch. Their movements were becoming sluggish, a dangerous sign of hypothermia setting in. The mother bear's distress was palpable as she paced the edge of the opening, her earlier patience giving way to growing anxiety. Using his military-grade rangefinder, Jim took precise measurements of the chamber's dimensions. The cubs were approximately 8 feet below the surface, with another 7 feet separating them from the illegal cache below. The opening was barely 3 feet wide, a tight squeeze for any rescue attempt. The structural integrity of the entire facility appeared compromised, likely due to recent heavy rains and the cubs' initial fall. As he completed his assessment, a new sound caught his attention. the distant buzz of an approaching vehicle. The mother bear heard it too, her head snapping up in alarm. Jim's trained ear recognized the sound of heavy-duty off-road tires, still several miles away, but getting closer. Someone was coming, and given the illegal nature of this facility, their arrival would likely make an already dangerous situation deadly. The confluence of circumstances, trapped cubs, dangerous criminal evidence, an approaching storm, and now the imminent arrival of potential hostiles, created a scenario that would have seemed implausible in any training exercise. Yet here he was, a retired Special Forces operator and a desperate mother bear, facing a situation that would require all of his military experience, and then some to resolve. Jim's mind raced through his combat experience, formulating a rapid response plan. The approaching vehicle gave him minutes at most, and he needed to make a series of critical decisions. The mother bear's agitation increased with each passing second, her powerful frame shifting anxiously between the opening where her cubs were trapped and the direction of the approaching threat. Drawing on his years of tactical training, Jim quickly established priorities. The cubs needed immediate rescue, but the evidence of illegal activity couldn't be ignored. More importantly, if the facility's operators returned to find their location compromised, they would likely relocate their operation, destroying crucial evidence in the process. The stakes had just risen dramatically. Using hand signals learned from years of working with military dogs, Jim attempted to communicate with the mother bear. To his amazement, she seemed to understand his gesture to stay low and quiet, perhaps responding more to his body language and tone than the actual signals. Her behavior continued to defy everything he knew about wild animals. The sound of the vehicle grew closer, now accompanied by the distinct rumble of a diesel engine. Jim estimated they had less than 10 minutes before whoever was approaching would reach the clearing. The storm's leading edge had arrived, with snow beginning to fall more heavily, reducing visibility but also potentially providing cover. Working quickly, Jim unpacked his rescue gear, laying out ropes and carabiners while keeping his movements low and efficient. The cubs watched from their precarious perch, their small forms shivering more noticeably now. The ledge they clung to had deteriorated further, with small pieces constantly crumbling away to fall onto the illegal cache below. The mother bear's behavior shifted suddenly, her attention fixed on the approaching vehicle sounds. She moved with surprising stealth for her size, positioning herself between the opening and the direction of the threat. It was as if she understood the need for security, acting instinctively as a lookout while Jim prepared the rescue attempt. Drawing on his Special Forces training in improvised rescue operations, Jim quickly modified his climbing gear to create a makeshift rescue cradle. The cubs were too weak to climb out on their own, and the space was too narrow for a conventional rescue. He needed something that could be lowered, secured, and raised with minimal movement or disturbance to the unstable structure. The vehicle sounds were closer now, accompanied by the crunch of tires on the frozen forest floor. Jim estimated they were less than 2 miles away, their approach slowed by the deteriorating weather conditions. The snowfall had intensified, reducing visibility but also masking their position from immediate discovery. Using his tactical backpack and emergency blankets, Jim constructed a lift system that could safely cradle one cub at a time. The mother bear watched his rapid work with focused attention, her earlier distress temporarily masked by an almost military-like alertness to their surroundings. Her behavior continued to amaze him. This was no ordinary grizzly. The first rescue attempt would be the riskiest. The cubs, though weak, still had enough energy to potentially panic during the lift, which could destabilize the entire structure. Jim needed to work quickly, but with absolute precision. Any mistake could send the cubs plummeting onto the dangerous cargo below, or worse, trigger a collapse that could bury them all. As he prepared to lower the makeshift cradle, the mother Bear suddenly tensed, her massive head turning sharply toward a new sound. The vehicle had stopped somewhere nearby, and multiple doors could be heard slamming shut. Voices carried on the wind, at least 3 distinct speakers, talking in hushed but urgent tones. Jim's combat instincts kicked into high gear. The approaching group was trying to move quietly, suggesting they weren't casual hikers or forest service personnel. Their attempt at stealth indicated they knew exactly where they were going and wanted to avoid detection. The situation had just become significantly more dangerous. The cubs, perhaps sensing the increased tension, had become perfectly still on their crumbling ledge. Even in their weakened state, they seemed to understand the need for absolute silence. The mother bear maintained her position, her powerful form concealed behind a snow-covered boulder, watching the direction of the approaching threats. Time had run out for careful planning. Jim now faced a nearly impossible challenge: executing a delicate rescue operation while avoiding detection by what he assumed were armed criminals, all during a worsening snowstorm. His years in special forces had prepared him for high-pressure situations, but this scenario was testing the limits of even his extensive experience. The voices were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of equipment being moved through the underbrush. The approaching group was taking a direct route to the facility, confirming they knew exactly where they were going. Jim had moments to decide: attempt the rescue and risk discovery, or retreat and potentially lose both the cubs and the evidence of criminal activity. Jim made his decision in a split second, drawing on years of combat experience. He couldn't retreat, not with 2 lives at stake and crucial evidence of criminal activity at risk. Instead, he would use the storm and approaching darkness to his advantage, just as he had done countless times in special forces operations. The mother bear, as if sensing his resolve, remained perfectly still in her concealed position. Moving. With practiced silence, Jim quickly adjusted his rescue plan. The approaching voices were still far enough away that a swift, quiet rescue might be possible. He modified his makeshift lift system, adding extra padding from his emergency kit to ensure complete silence during the operation. The cubs watched from their precarious perch, their small forms barely visible in the increasing snowfall. The criminal group's voices became clearer, 3 men speaking in hushed tones about checking the inventory and securing the site. Their footsteps crunched through the frozen undergrowth, still several hundred yards away, but moving with purpose. The storm's intensifying winds helped mask any small sounds from Jim's rescue preparation, but it also meant conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Using hand signals, Jim attempted to communicate his intent to the mother bear. To his continued amazement, she seemed to understand, maintaining her position while watching both him and the direction of the approaching threats. Her behavior suggested an almost supernatural level of comprehension, as if she grasped not only the danger, but the need for coordinated action. The first crucial moment came as Jim lowered the padded rescue cradle toward the cubs. The younger and weaker of the 2 had begun showing signs of severe hypothermia, its movements becoming dangerously sluggish. The makeshift lift, crafted from his tactical backpack and insulated with emergency blankets, descended slowly into the chamber. Every inch of movement had to be perfectly controlled to prevent any sound that might carry on the wind. The mother bear's ears suddenly perked up, her massive head turning slightly. The voices had stopped, replaced by the sound of equipment being set down and hushed instructions being given. The group had paused, presumably to get their bearings in the worsening storm. This pause might provide the crucial minutes needed for the rescue, but it also meant they were closer than comfortable. The first cub, the smaller one, barely reacted as the rescue cradle touched its ledge. Its lethargy, while dangerous for its health, made the rescue attempt easier. Jim carefully maneuvered the cradle under the tiny bear, using subtle movements of the rope to position it perfectly. The mother bear watched intently, her powerful form still hidden, but tensed with anticipation. Just as Jim began the delicate process of lifting the first cub, a beam of light cut through the snowfall. The criminals had produced flashlights and were scanning the area. The mother bear's reaction was instant and remarkable. She deliberately shifted her position, using her massive body to block any potential reflection from Jim's rescue equipment while maintaining her own concealment. The first lift was nerve-wracking. Every small sound, the gentle creak of the rope, the soft shuffle of the cub settling into the cradle, seemed magnified in Jim's heightened awareness. The voices had started moving again, closer now, discussing landmarks they were using to navigate to the cache. The storm had become both blessing and curse, providing concealment but making the rescue exponentially more difficult. As the first cub reached the surface, Jim faced another crucial moment. The tiny bear, though weak, might make a sound upon seeing its mother. The mother bear, however, proved once again that she was no ordinary grizzly. She remained in her concealed position, making no move toward her cub, seemingly understanding that silence was crucial for survival. Jim quickly but silently transferred the first cub to a sheltered position, wrapping it in thermal blankets from his kit. The small bear's body temperature was dangerously low, but it was alive and safely out of the chamber. The mother bear's discipline was remarkable. She maintained her guard position, dividing her attention between her rescued cub, the one still trapped, and the approaching threat. The second rescue would be more challenging. The remaining cub, though stronger, was more alert and thus more likely to move or make noise during the lift. The criminal group had drawn closer still. Jim could now make out fragments of their conversations about specific crates they needed to check. Time was running critically short. As Jim prepared to lower the rescue cradle again, a new sound froze. Everyone in place, the distinct click of a safety being removed from a firearm. The criminals had drawn weapons, perhaps standard procedure for checking their hidden cache. The situation had just become deadly. Even the mother bear seemed to understand the escalated threat, her massive form becoming impossibly still in her concealed position. The storm continued to intensify. Now nearly a full blizzard, the heavy snowfall and howling wind provided more cover, but also made the rescue exponentially more dangerous. Jim knew he had one chance to get the second cub out before the armed group reached their position. The next few minutes would require perfect execution, drawing on every bit of his special forces training and experience. The rescue of the second cub would require perfect timing and absolute silence. Jim could hear the armed men methodically making their way through the storm, their movements suggesting professional training. These weren't simple criminals. Their tactical approach and communication patterns indicated military or law enforcement background, making them far more dangerous. The remaining cub, stronger but more alert than its sibling, watched the descending rescue cradle with visible anxiety. Any sound now could give away their position to the approaching armed group. The mother bear maintained her incredible discipline, her massive form still shielding Jim's position while monitoring both the approaching threat and her cubs. Jim's years of special forces training proved crucial as he executed the rescue with calculated precision. Each movement was deliberate and silent, using the storm's growing intensity to mask any unavoidable sounds. The weather had deteriorated into near whiteout conditions, visibility dropping to mere feet. But the armed group continued their advance with concerning determination. The second cub, unlike its weaker sibling, actively responded to the rescue attempt. As the cradle touched the ledge, it shifted position, causing small fragments of debris to cascade onto the illegal cache below. The sound, though slight, carried on the wind. The mother bear's reaction was instant. She deliberately shifted, her weight creating natural forest sounds that covered her cub's movement. The armed men paused their advance, their lights sweeping the area. Jim could now make out more of their conversation, technical terms about specific crates and inventory. Numbers. Their voices carried the confident tone of professionals conducting a routine check, suggesting this wasn't their first visit to the hidden facility. As Jim began the crucial lift of the second cub, a new complication arose. The ledge weakened. By the first rescue, and the continuing deterioration of the structure began to crumble more significantly. The cub, stronger than its sibling, scrambled to maintain its position, creating more movement than the rescue plan could safely accommodate. The mother bear's next action demonstrated an almost supernatural level of awareness. She deliberately moved a branch with her massive paw, creating natural forest sounds that covered her cub's scrambling. The armed group paused again, there, lights sweeping the area, but the sounds registered as normal forest activity in the storm. Jim's makeshift lift system, though carefully crafted, wasn't designed for a struggling cub. The tactical backpack-turned rescue cradle swayed dangerously as the young bear fought against the unfamiliar sensation of being lifted. Each movement threatened to create noise that could carry through the storm to the approaching armed men, now close enough that their footsteps could be clearly heard. The mother bear's behavior continued to amaze as she somehow communicated calm to her struggling cub. Her soft, barely audible sounds, carried on the wind, seemed to reach her young one. The cub's struggles lessened, allowing Jim to continue the careful lift towards safety. The coordination between mother bear and human reached an almost symphonic level of precision. The armed group's lights suddenly cut through the snow, much closer than expected. They had changed their approach pattern, now moving more directly toward the hidden facility. Their voices, though muffled by the storm, carried tones of urgency. Something had made them suspicious, pushing them to accelerate their inspection. With the second cub halfway up, disaster nearly struck. The makeshift cradle caught on a protruding root, causing the rope to scrape against the chamber's edge. The sound, though slight, was different from natural forest noises. The armed men's lights immediately swung in their direction, cutting through the snow with professional precision. The mother bear's reaction was instantaneous and incredible. She deliberately moved away from her concealed position, creating obvious animal movement sounds that drew the armed men's attention. Her massive form, barely visible through the storm, appeared to them as a bear simply moving through its territory. The natural explanation seemed to satisfy them, their lights returning to their original search pattern. Jim seized this moment of distraction to complete the lift, pulling the second cub to safety with smooth, silent movements. Like its sibling, this cub was suffering from exposure, though its stronger condition had helped it maintain a safer body temperature. Both cubs were now safely wrapped in thermal blankets, their small forms huddled together in a sheltered position. The mother bear, having successfully diverted attention from the rescue, began a careful retreat toward her cubs. Her movement through the forest was a masterclass in stealth, especially impressive for an animal of her size. Each step was calculated to seem natural while covering the signs of the rescue operation. But they weren't safe yet. The armed group had reached the edge of the hidden facility, their lights now focused on finding the concealed entrance. Their professional movements and tactical spacing confirmed Jim's suspicions about their training. These men were dangerous, and the situation was far from over. The storm had reached full blizzard intensity, the wind howling through the trees with frightening force. The armed men were now only yards away from Jim's position, their lights sweeping the area with practiced efficiency. The rescued cubs, though safely concealed, were still at risk of making noise that could give away their position. The next few moments would determine whether this daring rescue would end in success or disaster. Jim watched through the swirling snow as the armed men reached the hidden facility's entrance. Their tactical movements and equipment confirmed his worst fears. These weren't common criminals, but highly trained operatives. Their quiet, professional commands and coordinated approach spoke of military or special operations background. The situation had become exponentially more dangerous. The cubs, though safely rescued, posed a new challenge. The weaker one had begun shivering violently despite the thermal blankets, its tiny body fighting against severe hypothermia. The stronger cub, responding to its siblings' distress, started making soft, whimpering sounds that could carry through the storm. The mother bear moved closer to her cubs, her massive body providing additional warmth and comfort. The armed group's leader, a tall figure carrying what Jim recognized as a modified, military-grade rifle, began clearing snow from the facility's entrance. His movements were precise and practiced, suggesting years of professional training. The other two men maintained a security perimeter, their weapons held ready as they scanned the surrounding forest through the intensifying storm. Using hand signals he'd learned in special forces, Jim communicated to the mother bear the need to move. To his continued amazement, she seemed to understand, gently nudging her cubs into stillness as she prepared to guide them to safety. Her behavior continued to defy everything known about wild animal intelligence and adaptation. The critical moment came when the lead operative discovered the damage to the facility's entrance. His sharp command cut through the howling wind, alerting his team to potential security breach. Their lights began sweeping the area more aggressively, searching for signs of intruders. The deteriorating weather provided cover, but also made any escape more challenging. Jim's military experience told him they had minutes at most before the team would begin a systematic search of the area. The tracks left by the rescue operation, though partially obscured by fresh snow, would eventually be discovered by these trained professionals. They needed to move immediately, but moving two hypothermic cubs through a blizzard presented its own life-threatening challenges. The mother bear once again demonstrated extraordinary intelligence. She began creating a series of false trails, moving in different directions while carefully avoiding the actual path they needed to take. Her massive paws deliberately left clear tracks in some areas, providing convincing evidence of a bear simply passing through during the storm. The armed men's attention shifted as they discovered the cub's original entry point into the facility. Their lights focused on the damaged section, voices carrying discussions about structural integrity and potential compromises to their cache. The leader ordered an immediate inventory check, sending one man down into the chamber while the others maintained security. Jim seized this opportunity to begin their retreat. Moving with the stealth that had kept him alive through countless combat missions, he gathered the cubs, still wrapped in thermal blankets, and prepared to navigate through the worsening storm. The mother bear positioned herself between them, and the armed group, her body providing both protection and concealment. The next few minutes became an intricate dance of survival. Every step had to be carefully chosen to avoid creating suspicious sounds that might carry through the storm. The cubs, despite their weakness, seemed to understand the need for silence. Even the stronger one had stopped its whimpering, moving with unprecedented quiet for such a young animal. The mother bear's guidance proved invaluable. She led them through natural gaps in the vegetation, choosing paths that would be masked by the storm and appear as normal wildlife movements to trained observers. Her knowledge of the terrain and natural animal behavior patterns helped them craft an escape that would appear completely ordinary to even the most suspicious eyes. A sudden shout from the facility caught everyone's attention. The man checking the cache had discovered something, likely evidence of the cub's presence or the rescue operation. The leader's sharp commands indicated an immediate shift from routine inspection to active search protocols. The situation had just become critically time-sensitive. The storm, now reaching its peak intensity, brought both help and hindrance. The near whiteout conditions and howling wind masked their movement but also made navigation treacherous. Jim's military training in Arctic operations became crucial as he worked to keep them oriented towards safety while protecting the vulnerable cubs from the lethal cold. The mother bear's next actions demonstrated yet another level of incredible adaptation. She began using the wind patterns to their advantage, timing their movements to coincide with the strongest gusts. This natural cover allowed them to put crucial distance between themselves and the armed searchers, whose lights could occasionally be seen cutting through the curtain of snow behind them. As they moved further from the facility, the sounds of the search party began to fade, replaced by the unrelenting roar of the blizzard, but they couldn't celebrate yet. The cubs' condition was deteriorating in the extreme cold, and they still had to navigate through miles of treacherous terrain before reaching the safety of Jim's cabin. The most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. The journey through the blizzard became a brutal test of endurance and survival skills. Jim's years of Special Forces winter warfare training were being pushed to their limits as he worked to keep the cubs alive while maintaining their escape. The mother bear, despite her incredible strength and natural adaptations, was also showing signs of exhaustion from her previous days of desperate searching and the intense rescue operation. The younger cub's condition had become critical. Despite being wrapped in thermal blankets, its small body was losing heat faster than Jim could safely counter in the extreme conditions. Every few hundred yards, they had to stop in whatever shelter they could find, fallen logs, dense brush, or rock formations, to help the cubs recover and prevent fatal hypothermia. During one such stop, protected from the worst of the wind behind a cluster of snow-laden pines, Jim made a crucial discovery. The larger cub wasn't just stronger, it was actively trying to share body heat with its sibling. The young bears pressed together inside their thermal wrapping, demonstrating an instinctive understanding of survival that mirrored their mother's extraordinary intelligence. The mother bear's behavior continued to amaze as she worked in almost perfect coordination with Jim. She would find sheltered spots for their frequent rest stops, then position herself to block the wind while Jim checked the cub's condition. Her massive body provided additional warmth, and she seemed to understand exactly how to position herself to maximize protection without risking injury to her weakened cubs. Their progress was agonizingly slow. What would normally be a 2-hour trek back to Jim's cabin had turned into a grueling marathon against the elements. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was intensifying. The temperature continued to drop, and the wind chill had reached dangerous levels that threatened them all with hypothermia. Jim's military training helped him recognize the signs of their deteriorating situation. His own extremities were beginning to lose sensation despite his professional-grade winter gear. The cubs, though protected by the thermal blankets, were showing increasingly concerning symptoms. Even the mother bear's thick winter coat couldn't fully protect her from these extreme conditions after her days of exhaustion. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the cabin when a new threat emerged. The wind carried fragments of sound, voices and the distant rumble of vehicles. The search had mobilized, expanding beyond the immediate area of the facility. The armed group had likely called in reinforcements, and the hunting pattern of lights visible through the storm suggested they were using vehicles to establish a broader search perimeter. The mother bear's reaction to this new threat demonstrated yet another level of tactical awareness. She began creating false trails again, this time more extensively. She would move away from their actual path, create obvious bear signs, then carefully return to them, using routes that would appear natural to even trained observers. Her understanding of deception tactics rivaled military training. The younger cub's condition reached a critical point during their next rest stop. Its breathing had become shallow, and its movements were dangerously weak. Jim knew they needed to make a difficult decision. Continuing at their current pace would likely result in losing the cub to hypothermia, but moving faster would increase their risk of detection by the expanding search party. The mother bear seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. She began gathering snow with her massive paws, piling it around their shelter spot. Jim quickly understood her intent. She was helping him construct an emergency snow shelter, a survival technique he'd learned in military winter warfare training. Together, they quickly built a temporary sanctuary from the storm. Inside the hastily constructed shelter, Jim worked to raise the cub's body temperature. He used emergency heat packs from his survival kit, carefully placing them around the weakened cub while monitoring its condition. The mother bear positioned herself at the entrance, her body providing additional insulation while she maintained watch for any approaching threats. The sounds of the search party grew closer, then began to fade again as the vehicles moved in a different direction. The storm was working in their favor, making any systematic search pattern difficult to maintain. However, it also meant that if they needed emergency assistance, they would be incredibly difficult to find. Jim checked his satellite GPS unit, confirming they still had roughly 3 miles to cover before reaching his cabin. Under normal conditions, this would be a manageable distance. In current conditions, with 2 hypothermic cubs and an exhausted mother bear, while avoiding an active search party, it seemed nearly impossible. The mother bear's next action showed she understood their predicament. She began repeatedly nosing at her cubs, then looking at Jim's backpack. Her meaning became clear when Jim remembered the emergency high-calorie rations in his pack. The bear somehow knew her cubs needed energy to continue their journey. This level of communication and problem-solving was unprecedented in wild animals, yet here was a mother bear not only accepting human help, but actively participating in survival strategy. As Jim carefully fed small pieces of his emergency rations to the cubs, he realized he was witnessing something that would challenge everything known about wildlife behavior and intelligence. The emergency rations provided a crucial boost of energy to the cubs, but they had to keep moving. The search party's vehicles could be heard changing patterns, suggesting a more systematic approach to their search. The storm, while still providing cover, had begun to show subtle signs of shifting direction, a change that could either help or hinder their escape, depending on how they used it. Jim's years of combat tracking told him their pursuers were professionals who wouldn't easily give up. The high-value nature of their hidden cache meant they would continue searching despite the dangerous weather conditions. Their vehicle movements suggested they were establishing a series of blocking positions, standard military doctrine for containing a security breach. The mother bear's reaction to the changing search patterns proved she understood the gravity of their situation. She began leading them through increasingly dense vegetation, choosing paths that would be difficult for vehicles to follow or observe. Her knowledge of the terrain was proving invaluable, as she found routes that provided maximum cover while still allowing them to make progress towards safety. The younger cub's condition had stabilized somewhat after the emergency rations and rest, but it was still dangerously weak. Its sibling had taken on a protective role, positioning itself to share warmth and occasionally nudging its weaker littermate to keep moving. The level of cooperation between the cubs demonstrated an emotional intelligence that challenged conventional understanding of wild animals. Using his military navigation skills, Jim kept them oriented toward his cabin while monitoring the search patterns visible through the storm. The pursuers had split into smaller teams, their lights appearing and disappearing through the curtain of snow. Each time the lights appeared closer, the mother bear would adjust their route, using her incredible instincts to keep them one step ahead. The storm's intensity had created deep snow drifts that threatened to exhaust them all. Jim found himself carrying both cubs through the worst sections, their small bodies wrapped together in the thermal blankets. The mother bear, despite her obvious fatigue, would forge ahead, breaking trail through the deepest snow to make their passage easier. Their progress became a series of careful advances between patches of cover, each movement calculated to appear natural if spotted by the searchers. The mother bear's understanding of this tactic was remarkable. She would wait for the wind to mask their movement, time their advances between the sweeping patterns of the searchers' lights, and use natural features to break up their silhouette. Against the snow, a particularly close call came when one of the search vehicles stopped barely 100 yards from their position. The sound of doors opening carried through the storm, followed by voices discussing tracks they'd discovered. The mother bear immediately guided them into a dense thicket, then deliberately created visible tracks leading away from their actual position. Her deception worked perfectly. The searchers followed the false trail. The cubs' survival instincts continued to impress as they maintained almost complete silence despite their distress, even when they had to cross exposed areas, leaving them vulnerable to discovery. The young bears seemed to understand the need for absolute quiet. Their behavior suggested an almost supernatural awareness of the situation's gravity. Jim's satellite GPS showed they were now within 2 miles of his cabin, but these would be the most dangerous miles yet. The search pattern had shifted, concentrating more forces in their direction. Whether by skill or luck, the pursuers seemed to be closing in on their general location. The professional manner of the search confirmed these men had serious military or law enforcement training. The mother bear's next actions demonstrated yet another level of tactical thinking. She began creating a complex series of crisscrossing tracks, breaking their trail into confusing patterns that would be difficult to follow even for experienced trackers. She would double back, circle around, and use fallen trees and rocks to break up their trail, all while maintaining their general direction toward safety. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind chill had reached lethal levels. Jim's own military-grade cold weather gear was barely keeping him functional, and he worried about the cubs despite their natural adaptations and the thermal blankets. The mother bear's pace showed she shared his concern. She was pushing them as fast as safety would allow. Their route took them through a particularly dense section of forest, where the trees provided some shelter from the wind, but also limited visibility. The reduced visibility was both blessing and curse. It helped conceal their movement, but also meant they could stumble into the searchers with little warning. The mother bear's senses became crucial here, her acute hearing and smell, allowing her to detect approaching threats before they became visible. The cubs had begun shivering violently again, their small bodies fighting against the extreme cold despite all protective measures. The stronger cub maintained its protective position around its sibling, but both were clearly reaching their limits. The mother bear's worried glances at her cubs spoke volumes about the race against time they were facing. With just over a mile left to cover, they encountered their most dangerous challenge yet. The search pattern had shifted again, this time forming a loose perimeter that threatened to cut off their route to the cabin. Through the swirling snow, Jim could make out at least 3 vehicles positioned strategically along the likely escape routes. The professional coordination of the search pattern confirmed his worst fears about the pursuers' capabilities. The mother bear's reaction to this new threat demonstrated remarkable tactical awareness. She led them to a concealed position behind a fallen pine, then spent several minutes observing the searchers' movements through the storm. Her behavior mimicked military reconnaissance techniques, analyzing patrol patterns and identifying gaps in the coverage. The intelligence behind her actions continued to astound Jim. The cub's condition had become critical again. The younger one was barely conscious, its small body temperature dropping dangerously despite the thermal blankets and its siblings' efforts to share warmth. The stronger cub, though still alert, was showing signs of exhaustion that worried Jim. Even their mother's enormous strength was flagging after days without proper rest and food. Using his special forces training, Jim assessed their options. The most direct route to his cabin was now blocked by the search teams. Taking a longer route would mean more time exposed to the lethal cold, which the cubs might not survive. They needed a solution that balanced the risks of detection against the cubs' deteriorating condition. The mother bear seemed to reach a similar conclusion. She began moving parallel to the searchers' perimeter, staying just far enough back to remain undetected while looking for a gap in their coverage. Her understanding of tactical movement rivaled military training. She kept them in shadows, used the storm for concealment, and timed their movements to coincide with the searchers' patterns. A breakthrough came when one of the search vehicles began experiencing mechanical problems, likely due to the extreme cold. The sound of its engine struggling carried through the storm, followed by frustrated voices discussing the need to relocate that position. The mother bear immediately recognized this opportunity, her massive head turning toward Jim, as if confirming his awareness of the gap about to open in their perimeter. They had to time their movement perfectly. The struggling vehicle would create a brief window in the search pattern, but moving too soon would expose them to the other search teams. The mother bear's patience was remarkable as they waited for the precise moment. The cubs, despite their weakness, remained absolutely still, as if understanding the crucial nature of their timing. When the vehicle finally moved, the mother bear led them through the gap with incredible precision. Her path took advantage of every available cover, snowdrifts, vegetation clusters, terrain features, while maintaining their progress toward the cabin. The sophistication of her movement would have impressed any military tactical instructor. The final approach to the cabin presented new challenges. The searchlights had begun sweeping in increasingly tight patterns, suggesting the pursuers were beginning to focus on this area. They would need to cross about 200 yards of relatively open terrain to reach the cabin's rear entrance. In the stormy darkness, it might as well have been 2 miles. The mother bear's solution to this challenge showed yet another level of strategic thinking. She began creating a series of false trails leading away from their position, each one more obvious than the last. The deception was carefully crafted to draw attention away from their actual route. Her understanding of human search patterns and tracking methods seemed almost supernatural. Jim's cabin security system would normally be an asset, but now it presented a risk. The motion sensors and security lights could give away their approach if not properly managed. He needed to time their final movement perfectly to avoid triggering any alerts that might draw the searchers' attention. The cub's condition made the timing even more critical. The younger one had become almost completely unresponsive, while the stronger cub's movements were becoming dangerously sluggish. Even the mother bear's incredible stamina was reaching its limits after days without proper rest and the intensity of the rescue operation. Using his satellite control system, Jim carefully adjusted his cabin's security settings, creating a narrow window for their approach. The mother bear watched this preparation with obvious understanding, waiting for his signal before beginning their final movement. Her trust in his expertise matched his respect for her incredible intelligence. The storm reached a new level of intensity just as they prepared to make their final approach. The wind howled with renewed fury, driving snow and ice horizontally through the air. While this made movement more challenging, it also provided additional cover from the searchers' lights and electronic detection equipment. The sounds of the search party had drawn closer again, their voices carried intermittently on the howling wind. The professional manner of their communication confirmed these were highly trained operators, likely with military or special operations background. Their methodical search pattern was closing in on the cabin's location, making timing absolutely crucial for the final sprint to safety. The final approach to the cabin became an exercise in perfect timing and coordination. Jim used signals to coordinate with the mother bear, amazed at how she seemed to understand his military-style communications. They would need to move during the gaps between sweeping searchlights, using the storm's intensifying fury as additional cover. The cub's condition had become dire. The younger one was completely still now, its survival depending entirely on its siblings' body heat and the thermal blankets. The stronger cub, despite its own exhaustion, maintained physical contact with its litter mate, demonstrating an instinctive understanding of survival priorities. Their mother's worried glances spoke volumes about the urgency of their situation. Jim's cabin security system presented both advantage and risk. While it could provide early warning of approaching threats, it could also betray their presence if not carefully managed. He had remotely disabled the most obvious security features, but some systems had to remain active to monitor the searchers' movements. The delicate balance required split-second timing. The mother bear's next actions proved she understood the complexity of their situation. She began creating a final series of false trails, each one more convincing than the last. Her deception techniques would have impressed any military tracker. She used fallen snow from branches, deliberate paw prints, and even broken twigs to craft a completely believable story of a bear moving away from the cabin area. The search party's movements had become more focused. Their radio communications, carried fragmentally on the wind, indicated they were establishing a tighter perimeter around the general area. The professional precision of their search pattern suggested they had experience in winter tracking operations. Time was running critically short. Using his tactical experience, Jim identified their best approach vector, a natural depression in the terrain, combined with the storm's direction, would provide maximum concealment for their final movement. The mother bear, watching his assessment, seemed to agree with his choice, positioning herself to lead the way while keeping her cubs protected between them. The storm's intensity worked in their favor during the approach. The howling wind and driving snow reduced visibility to mere feet, making visual detection nearly impossible. However, these same conditions also meant they had to rely almost entirely on Jim's knowledge of the terrain and the mother bear's incredible instincts to navigate the final distance. Their movement became a carefully choreographed dance between the sweeping patterns of the searchers' lights. The mother bear demonstrated an almost supernatural awareness of the search team's movements, timing their advances perfectly to avoid detection. Her ability to predict and exploit gaps in the search pattern rivaled professional military training. The cubs, despite their critical condition, maintained absolute silence during the approach. Even the stronger cub, struggling to keep its sibling warm, seemed to understand the crucial need for stealth. Their behavior continued to challenge everything known about wildlife intelligence and adaptation. When they were within 50 yards of the cabin, disaster nearly struck. One of the search teams had flanked wider than expected, their lights suddenly cutting through the storm much closer than anticipated. The mother bear's reaction was instantaneous. She used her massive body to shield the cubs and Jim from view, while simultaneously creating natural forest sounds that would appear normal to the searchers. The final yards to the cabin became a heart-stopping test of nerve and timing. Each movement had to be perfectly calculated, using the storm's strongest gusts to cover any sound or movement. The mother bear's coordination with Jim reached an almost telepathic level, their movements synchronized to maximize concealment and efficiency. The cabin's rear entrance was now tantalizingly close, but it presented one final challenge. The approach to the door would leave them briefly exposed if any of the searchers happened to be looking in the right direction at the wrong moment. The mother bear's solution was brilliant. She deliberately created a distraction by dislodging snow from a distant tree branch, drawing the searchers' attention away from their position. Jim's hands were nearly numb as he worked to unlock the cabin's rear door, his fingers clumsy with cold despite his professional-grade winter gear. The mother bear maintained a protective position, her massive form blocking them from view while scanning continuously for threats. Her military-like discipline never wavered despite her obvious exhaustion. The cubs were barely moving now, both of them dangerously cold despite all protective measures. Even the stronger cub's survival instincts were fading as hypothermia took its toll. The mother bear's soft sounds of distress communicated the urgency more clearly than words ever could. Getting the door open without making noise proved nearly impossible in the extreme cold. Every movement of the lock mechanism seemed magnified in the howling wind. The mother bear somehow sensed this challenge, timing her movements to cover any sounds that might carry to the searchers' positions. Finally, agonizingly, the door opened just enough to allow them inside. The mother bear's natural caution warred visibly with her desperate need to get her cubs to safety. Her behavior in these final moments demonstrated yet another level of incredible adaptation. She understood they needed to enter the cabin quietly and carefully, despite every maternal instinct urging her to rush to safety. The transition into the cabin became a delicate operation, requiring perfect coordination. Jim moved first, quickly establishing security, while the mother bear guided her cubs through the narrow entrance. Her massive frame barely fit through the doorway, yet she managed to enter with remarkable silence and grace, despite her size and exhaustion. Inside, the cabin's emergency lighting cast a soft glow that revealed the cub's critical condition. The younger one remained motionless, its breathing shallow and irregular, while the stronger cub had finally succumbed to exhaustion once they reached safety. The mother bear's worried sounds took on a new urgency as she gently nosed her unconscious cubs. Jim immediately initiated emergency protocols he'd learned during his Special Forces medical training. The cabin's main room quickly transformed into a wildlife intensive care unit. He activated his backup heating system, carefully calibrating. The temperature increased to avoid shocking the cub's systems. The mother bear watched his every move, her intelligent eyes following his actions with clear understanding. Using his military medical supplies and wilderness first aid equipment, Jim began treating the cubs for severe hypothermia. The process required delicate handling. Warming them too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold itself. The mother bear's behavior during this critical care period demonstrated an almost human-like comprehension of medical treatment. The search party's lights occasionally swept past the cabin's windows, their beams partially visible even through the carefully maintained blackout curtains. The mother bear positioned herself to block any potential slivers of light that might escape, her massive form providing additional security while Jim worked to save her cubs. The younger cub's condition presented the greatest challenge. Its core temperature had dropped dangerously low, and its vital signs were weakening. Jim employed every survival technique he'd learned in the military, using a combination of passive and active warming methods. The mother bear assisted instinctively, using her body heat to help warm her cubs while allowing Jim to provide necessary medical care. Outside, the searchers' movements became more focused around the cabin area. Their voices, though muffled by the storm, carried tones of professional suspicion. They knew something was different about this section of the search grid, but the mother bear's elaborate false trails had successfully confused their tracking efforts. The stronger cub began showing signs of recovery first. Its breathing steadied, and it started responding to its mother's gentle encouragement. The young bear's resilience was remarkable, its survival instincts helping it fight back from the brink of hypothermia. However, its sibling's condition remained critical, requiring constant monitoring and care. Jim's satellite communications system picked up increased radio traffic among the search teams. They were discussing expanding their search perimeter, but the storm's intensity was forcing them to consider suspending operations until conditions improved. The mother bear seemed to understand the implications of these developments, her tension visibly easing as the threat of discovery began to recede. The cabin's reinforced walls groaned under the storm's assault as Jim continued his emergency medical care. He had trained for combat trauma and wilderness survival, but treating hypothermic bear cubs while evading professional search teams was beyond any scenario he'd encountered in special forces. The mother bear's trust and cooperation made the impossible task manageable. Hours passed in a careful balance of medical treatment and security maintenance. The younger cub's condition improved gradually, its small body finally beginning to maintain its own temperature. The mother bear's relief was palpable as both her cubs showed increasing signs of recovery. Her extraordinary journey, from desperately seeking help to coordinating their escape, had succeeded against overwhelming odds. The storm continued to rage outside, now working in their favor by forcing the search teams to withdraw. The sounds of vehicles starting and moving away carried through the howling wind, confirming that the immediate threat was passing. However, Jim knew professionals of this caliber wouldn't give up easily. They would return once conditions improved. Inside the cabin, a remarkable scene unfolded as the cubs regained consciousness. The stronger cub immediately checked on its sibling, maintaining physical contact and sharing warmth. The mother bear's behavior shifted from worried vigilance to gentle care, though she remained alert to any sounds that might indicate danger. Jim's military training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing quite matched the experience of watching these three bears adapt to their temporary sanctuary. The mother bear's awareness of security needs remained sharp even as she tended to her cubs. She would periodically check the windows and door, coordinating with Jim to maintain their safety. The younger cub's first conscious movements brought visible relief to both its mother and sibling. Though still weak, its recovery had crossed a crucial threshold. The family's interaction during these moments revealed complex emotional bonds that challenged conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. Their coordination and mutual support demonstrated levels of intelligence and adaptation that would revolutionize scientific understanding of these magnificent animals. Over the next few days, Jim's cabin became a unique sanctuary for this extraordinary bear family. The mother bear maintained an almost military-like vigilance while her cubs recovered, coordinating with Jim in a way that defied everything known about wild animal behavior. Her ability to understand and adapt to the situation continued to amaze him, challenging his already extensive experience with wildlife. The cub's recovery proved to be remarkable. The stronger cub regained its strength quickly, soon showing the playful energy typical of young bears. Its weaker sibling's recovery was slower but steady, supported constantly by both its mother and brother. The family's interactions revealed complex social behaviors that would fascinate wildlife experts for years to come. Jim's satellite communications picked up occasional chatter from the search teams. Though the storm had forced them to suspend immediate operations, they maintained surveillance of the broader area. Their professional persistence confirmed his initial assessment. These were highly trained operatives protecting something far more significant than a simple criminal enterprise. The mother bear's intelligence shone through in her adaptation to cabin life. She quickly understood the need to minimize movement during daylight hours, keeping her cubs quiet and away from windows. Her grasp of security protocols rivaled military training, and she worked seamlessly with Jim to maintain their safety. Using his special forces contacts, Jim discreetly reported the hidden facility's location and contents to trusted authorities. The information would eventually lead to a major investigation, uncovering a sophisticated criminal network operating throughout the region. The mother bear's desperate search for help had inadvertently exposed an operation that had eluded law enforcement for years. As the cubs grew stronger, their personalities emerged more clearly. The stronger cub maintained its protective nature toward its sibling, while the younger one showed remarkable resilience in its recovery. Together, they demonstrated levels of emotional intelligence that would challenge scientific understanding of bear behavior for years to come. The mother bear's decision to seek human help had been extraordinary enough, but her subsequent behavior, coordinating their escape, maintaining security, and adapting to temporary cabin life, suggested levels of intelligence previously thought impossible in wild animals. Her actions would later become the subject of numerous wildlife behavior studies. After a week of recovery, it became clear the cubs were strong enough to return to the wild. The search teams had reduced their presence to occasional patrols, creating a window of opportunity for the bear's safe departure. The mother bear seemed to understand this timing, becoming more alert to outside conditions and forest sounds. The night they chose for departure was clear and cold, with a bright moon illuminating the snow-covered landscape. The mother bear's behavior showed she understood this was goodbye. She approached Jim with a level of trust that defied conventional wildlife behavior, making soft sounds that seemed to convey gratitude. The cubs, now fully recovered, followed their mother's lead, but showed their own form of farewell. The stronger cub, which had demonstrated such remarkable protective instincts, approached Jim briefly before rejoining its family. The younger one, whose survival had once seemed impossible, looked back one final time before disappearing into the forest with its mother and sibling. Jim maintained his surveillance equipment in the following weeks, occasionally catching glimpses of the bear family thriving in their natural habitat. The mother bear had led them to a new territory, far from the hidden facility and its dangers. Her choice of location demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking, selecting an area rich in natural food sources and natural protection. The criminal facility was eventually raided by federal authorities, leading to multiple arrests and the discovery of an international smuggling operation. The mother bear's desperate search for help had inadvertently contributed to dismantling a major criminal enterprise, though this would remain known to only a few individuals. Years later, wildlife researchers in the area would occasionally report sightings of an unusually intelligent bear teaching her growing cubs complex survival skills. While they couldn't confirm it was the same bear, the described behaviors matched the extraordinary intelligence Jim had witnessed. The cubs, now approaching maturity, showed the same remarkable adaptability and intelligence as their mother. The story of the mother bear's incredible journey from desperate parent to strategic ally remained largely untold, known only to Jim and a handful of trusted contacts. Her actions had not only saved her cubs, but had demonstrated levels of intelligence, trust, and adaptation that would challenge scientific understanding of wildlife behavior for years to come. Jim often reflected on those crucial days, remembering how a mother bear's desperate decision to trust a human had led to one of the most extraordinary experiences of his military and civilian life. The event had proved that sometimes the greatest demonstrations of intelligence, courage, and adaptability come from the most unexpected sources, challenging our understanding of the natural world and the creatures we share it with. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.